You're very welcome. My name is Megan Carmody. I am the head of movement building in Friends of the Earth, which means that I work on a lot of our educational work, a lot of the activism support work that we do. You're very welcome to this climate justice webinar, which is a discussion based on the book by Mary Robinson. And this is the first event of our Learning Hub for 2020 and 2021. So many of you on the call may have voted in our online vote. It was a public vote to choose the 4 books that we're going to explore over the next year via these webinars and also via more participatory development education style workshops. So the first of those, which will also be around this topic of climate justice, will be happening in a few weeks. But this webinar is a chance for you to really get a taster for the topic and to be introduced to a few of the core concepts. So we've invited a few esteemed speakers to help us pick up some of those threads that Mary Robinson touched on in her book. So we're joined by Nathan Thanki, who I'll introduce in just a moment, Seán McCabe, Ciara Murphy and Áine O'Gorman. And each of them will speak to their area of expertise, as well as the ways that you can get involved in this global issue, but really touching on what you can do locally. So I'm going to just start with some of the housekeeping. So obviously this is a webinar. I can't see any of you. You can see us. For many of you who've joined previous webinars that we've run and that we've run with our colleagues in Stop Climate Chaos, this will all be very familiar to you. But for those of you who haven't been involved in a webinar like this, I'll just go through some of the key functions. So you can see at the bottom of your screen a chat box. So you can use that to introduce yourself, say where you're from, if you're involved in any groups. So I'll invite you to do that now, just your name, where you're calling in from and what groups or group you're part of, if any. And then you'll also see a Q&A box. So throughout the entire session, if you have any questions related to the topics, I'll ask you to just pop them in here rather than the comment box, so that our panelists can be having a look at them throughout the session and that they can respond to them during the session. Yeah, so you can, rather than the comment box for questions, try to use that Q&A box. And my colleague Áine will be collating them throughout the session and clustering them around certain themes so that we can make the best use of the time available to us, and the speakers can kind of take a few of the questions together. Yeah, so also within the Q&A box, you will have an option when there are questions in there to upvote them, which essentially means if you really want a certain question answered, you just click upvote. So then we'll be able to see really easily which questions are garnering the most interest for the participants on the call, and they're the ones I'll encourage the panelists to answer. So please use that function as much as you can during the session. And if you have a specific panelist or speaker that you want to answer a certain question, just let that be known in your question. Yeah, and just to say as well, this Learning Hub, it's an opportunity for you to really explore and educate yourself around certain concepts. So Mary Robinson's book about climate justice was the winner of our poll. The second book was called Violent Borders by Rhys Jones, and that's the one we'll be looking at next. Then we had On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal by Naomi Klein, and that's the third book that we'll be looking at over the next year. And then we had Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. So that'll be the fourth one that we look at throughout the year. So I really encourage you to use this session as a jumping off point for your own involvement and participation in this Learning Hub, which is really a space to cultivate an environment where you can explore these concepts yourself and try to think about how they relate to your own life, to your own actions, and yeah, find ways for you to really take action on them. So before we move on, I just have a quick poll, just so we can get a little bit of participation. Although obviously with a webinar like this, it's not very participatory, and that will come later in our development education session that I mentioned. So firstly, everybody could vote in this poll, just so that myself and the panelists can get a little bit of an understanding about who on the call might not be as comfortable with English, and that can help us to maybe slow down our speaking if you speak fast, like I tend to do. Okay, great. So yeah, a good few people have English as their first language. There's a handful of people that don't. So this is an opportunity for me to just ask the panelists now and everybody who'll be speaking to just try to be as clear in your language as possible, and try to reduce the amount of jargon that you use when speaking, and speak as slowly as you can with the time that you have, so that people can really understand what you're saying. Perfect. So we have those results there. And I have one more poll. So this is to try and assess the level of confidence we have collectively here around climate justice. So it's how confident would you feel explaining what climate justice is to somebody who has recently become interested in climate change? Okay, so the majority of people we can see are kind of mildly confident or quite confident, and then two smaller groups at the extremes of the spectrum that are not confident or very confident. Lovely, thank you everybody for participating in that. Apologies, that's my cat in the background, if anybody can hear that. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nathan. And Nathan is the co-coordinator of the global campaign to demand climate justice. And he's also the focal point for climate justice groups at the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And if you'd like to follow him on Twitter, he's an avid writer and writes for Medium and The World at One Degree. And I'll pop his Twitter handle in the comment box. But yeah, without further ado, hand over to you, Nathan.
Thanks very much, Megan. Yeah, nice to be on this webinar. Thanks for having me. I'll just launch right in if that's okay, because we've got a lot of ground to cover. And I've just been reminded to speak slowly, so I'll try and do that while covering all of it. So you're probably aware, because you're on this webinar, that the term climate justice has become kind of a popular slogan in the last few years, in the last decade. I just want to, at the outset, say that it's not a new idea in itself, even if it is sort of newly popular. The ideas that form climate justice have sort of been developed over decades through debate between various social movements around the world, not only environmental movements, but also movements for trade justice, peasant movements, anti-globalization movements, trade unions, etc. I think some key moments that I just like to flag or recognize that went on to sort of form some of what you might call like the canon of climate justice would be environmental justice principles being developed in 1991 in the United States, a very important essay called Greenhouse Gangsters versus Climate Justice from 1999, the Bali Principles of Climate Justice that were written by movements that gathered in Bali in Indonesia in 2002. Again in Bali in 2007, the formation of a network called Climate Justice Now as an alternative to the mainstream climate action networks. Countless other eco-socialist declarations throughout the years. 30,000 people gathering in Cochabamba in 2010 for the World People's Conference on Climate Change, the formation of the network that I helped to coordinate, Demand Climate Justice in 2012, the People's Climate Test in 2015, and People's Demands in 2018. So that will probably give you a sense that climate justice is largely defined in an international context, and that some of those key concepts, such as that I'll cover in this presentation, such as climate debt, have been produced, refined, and socialized mainly by social movements, and mainly in the global south, so in the parts of the world that we sometimes talk about as the developing world, or as the third world, or as places that have been colonized, as the global majority. There's lots of terms, but just so you know what I mean, I'll use global south throughout this. That's often been met with pushback by various elements within even climate movements, in the global north, and attempts at co-option as well. So that's important to realize. I think although the meaning of climate justice is something of an empirical matter, as I've just outlined, you can do the research and see it's there. It's not like all a matter of opinion, even if it evolves, because we're talking about justice, and that's a subjective field. We sometimes mean different things when we call for climate justice. So not everyone who's on the street saying, what do we want? Climate justice, means the same thing and has the same vision. But I think for most of us, the general outline is fairly clear, yeah? I think that nobody would look at what the situation that this cartoon is depicting and say, that's fine, like that's a very fair way to do things. That's what climate justice is. But at the same time, a lot of the climate movement is in essence advocating for this when it comes to what they ask and demand of their own governments, particularly via other governments. So we'll talk a little bit about the United Nations later, but not too much. I think it's helpful to conceive of climate justice as a way to understand the climate crisis, rather than like something that can just be very easily defined. I think if you look at these two images, for example, they sort of they're saying kind of the same thing. They're using a lot of the same words, but they're describing maybe very different ways of understanding how we got here. So I would say that climate justice views climate breakdown as a result of profit-driven and growth-oriented systems of extraction, production, distribution, and consumption, which sacrifice the needs of the many and the well-being of the planet for the interests of the few. So it would follow then that all the climate justice movements would understand climate change as fundamentally a question of power, because it's the result of unequal and exploitative economic and social structures across the typical fault lines that we might think about in terms of gender, class, race, geography, etc. I would say climate justice, is based on an understanding that while we all need to act, there's a necessity for global action. The sort of historical responsibility for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions over the last 250 years lie with the industrialized world, the global north. So cheap energy in the form of fossil fuels has been that engine of our rapid industrialization and the basis for our economic growth. And colonialism and slavery laid the foundations for the current economic system, we can call it capitalism, to be built. You'll often hear that we're all in the same boat because we're all living on the same planet. We're not, in fact, all in the same boat, or if we are, to sort of string out a sort of well-used analogy, maybe it's the Titanic, right? It's sinking, the life rafts have been stolen, third-class passengers are locked below decks, are already drowning. When we think about the climate crisis, we're thinking about the immediate present. We're not thinking about the future. There's communities around the world in the global south, as well as what we might think of as the global south in the north, or the most affected peoples in our own countries that have borne the burden of fossil fuel extraction, transportation, and production. They now face the worst impacts of climate change itself. So not only the sources of climate change impact them, but also the result of climate change, whether that's food shortages, whether that's inundation of whole islands. You don't need me to go over the impacts. Climate justice asks what the factors are that create such inequality. So why does a country like Senegal have 40 times fewer funds than a country like Sweden? While at the same time, the average person in Sweden emits maybe 8 times more carbon emissions than the average person in Senegal. Why is it that the majority of people that live on less than $1.25 a day are in Africa and Asia and none in Europe? It's important to note this. I don't just do it for the sake of it, but because those budgets that people have available to them and the governments and states have available to them are what enable us to prepare for climate shocks, for the foreseeable climate shocks that we know are coming, as well as to attempt to repair the already occurring damages that are sort of stacking up. It's public spending that attempts to meet our rights to food, housing, an adequate state of living, health, education, clean air, etc., etc. as well as for the flood defences and the social protection and ecological restoration that will be needed as we sort of blow past our budget for 1.5. But a lot of countries are actually just bleeding money, essentially. So even though we have a common misconception really, that a lot of money is going to the global south in the form of remittances or in the form of, how nice are we give charity and there's official development assistance from our governments. A lot of that money, in fact, more goes out than comes in. This is because a lot of that money just turns back around and is used to service crazy debts, sort of illegitimate debts that have been racked up from structural readjustment programs through the IMF and the World Bank, and that have very unfavorable conditions on loans. And so climate justice, in essence, is about sort of thinking about all of these root causes, not just about emissions and fossil fuels and carbon, but about the entire sort of web of social reality that climate change occurs in. This is a really important graphic that you've probably seen before. The bulk of it is that sort of champagne glass is what it's called. It's from a famous Oxfam report, 2015, about inequality. What it's saying is that the richest 10%, and probably we're in the richest 10%, are in receipt of 52% of global income, while the poorest 50% are in receipt of about 8%. That also directly corresponds to our emissions. So the richest 10% also are responsible for about 50% of global emissions, and the bottom 50% for about 10%. It's not just a historical thing, it's also a current thing. So new research by Oxfam this year has shown that in the last 25 years, it's the same dynamic. The richest are responsible for the increases in emissions, as well as all of the historical ones. So this raises a lot of questions. We talk about a global middle class. That global middle class majority is in the global south, or almost in its entirety is in the global south, and is living on less than $20 a day. That's not very middle class. That's what we would consider to be quite poor. And the geographical spread of these people is shocking, right? We think that there's elites in China and India. Of course there are, but there are not that many elites in China and India as a percentage of the global population. It's overwhelmingly in our countries in the global north where we will find the elites that are responsible. So what do we want? Like, this is sort of what I've just described is like a bit of the analysis about what the situation we're in is. So climate justice movements aren't just about, saying that this is the problem. We're also about demanding and envisioning a sort of alternative. So some of the examples here that I would say are like accurate sort of reflection of what climate movements have demanded over the decades, although imperfectly sort of categorized, are as follows. And I think they mostly are framed in the light of system change rather than like quite incremental policy gains, even if we can always fight for those types of improvements in policy in domestic and in international settings, of course. But I think climate justice demands a sort of overhaul of the systems that we live in and under. So some of the areas in which climate justice demands have historically been made are that we want to limit global warming as much as possible, so as much as is physically possible, whether that is 1 degree as we used to demand, now it's 1.5. We will always demand the minimum level of warming. We also will demand an equitable response to climate change, so equitable sharing of the global effort. I'll get into that in a bit more detail in a second. We're also very against false solutions. There's a lot of peddlers of false solutions, whether that's a quick techno fix, some of the mad geoengineering ideas you might have heard about. Let's blast some mirrors into space. Let's seed the oceans with iron. Let's take over entire continents and have tree plantations to suck down carbon. We're against that. These are distractions. Climate justice is very much in favor of real solutions that put people first. So thinking about the sort of social consequences of a lot of climate action. We're also about, as I said, dealing with the impacts that are already happening. and helping people to deal with those impacts. So in the UN, it's talked about a lot as loss and damage or disaster risk reduction. But those are technical terms. I think we understand it in more visceral terms. It's an emergency, as people are fond of saying. It has to be treated like one. That emergency is underway. Seán, I believe, is going to talk a lot more about a just transition. That's a sort of key demand that climate movement has taken on, that's been developed by trade unionists over the years and the labour movement. Similarly, there's a clear demand to end the corporate interference and impunity and sort of hold corporations to account, because they're getting away with a lot of stuff. Another way of cutting the pie in terms of responsibility you've already probably been aware of is, you know, the famous 70% of emissions can be accorded to like 100 fossil fuel companies. And of course, we're also interested in having like fair and science-based approaches at the international arena, which unfortunately we don't have. So this is the network that I help to coordinate. This is sort of our platform that reflects a lot of those things as well. I said I would talk about fair shares. I don't want to get into a lot of detail. I can give you some resources to look up what, for example, Ireland's fair share would be in your own time. But it's essentially taking sort of the global budget for staying below 1.5 and dividing that between countries on the basis of how responsible they are for causing the climate crisis and how capable they are of doing that. And when you sort of input those into a framework that's called the Fair Shares Framework, you can get like basically gigaton figures. So the UK's one is quite shocking. You can see sort of where the current target for the UK is and where promises of net zero would be. That's only half the picture, because the UK has such a large responsibility in terms of its history that it couldn't, even if it went to zero emissions, no one does anything in the UK tomorrow, that would only be half the story. It would have to support the same again. So you can see the figure there in terms of megatons of carbon, but that it doesn't really matter what the number is. It's a big one, and it's a lot more than anybody's even thinking about. That's before you even get into discussing what the responsibility is for the actual damages that are occurring. So I think I'm at time. I'll wrap up there. If you want to check out what Ireland's is, it's a bit complicated because it's obviously part of the EU, and so the EU puts forward a budget rather than Ireland itself. But you can look up those statistics and play around with the calculator. I'll drop a link in the chat, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Nathan. And it was really, really interesting. And I think the images were really striking for the audience. I have a couple of follow-up questions. I think I'll just ask one before we move on to Seán. So in the book that we were looking at, that we're kind of basing our discussions on, Mary Robinson's Climate Justice, she heralds the Paris Agreement for potentially saving South Pacific islands such as Kiribati from disappearing due to sea level rise. And this is from a review in the Irish Times shortly after that book was released. And it says that was without acknowledging our actions to date have likely sealed their fate. It is difficult to reconcile her optimism while her home country ranks worst in Europe on climate action, one of only a few EU countries in which greenhouse gas emissions continue to climb, and that was in 2018. So in your opinion, like what was I know this is a big question, but the outcome of the Paris Agreement, and was it good enough? I know there were like lots of groups and you were there, you know, with them that were shouting 1.5 to stay alive. So obviously our trajectory isn't necessarily reflecting that. So could you speak to that? Yeah, the Paris Agreement, it's often portrayed as kind of a panacea, and it was a really, really great thing. But yeah, was it good enough, in your opinion?
In a word, no. I don't think anything is going to be good enough. I don't think anybody expected it to be good enough. It sort of is a significant weakening of a lot of the existing sort of principles that were informing what international climate policy would be. So principles around historical responsibility, around equity. Paris kind of dilutes them. But it's kind of a matter of like glass half full, glass half empty. I don't think anybody would just dismiss it out of hand. But I also find it very difficult to accept Mary Robinson's optimism in her reading of the Paris Agreement. I would agree with the quote from Ciara that, in fact, I mean, I don't want to say like small islands are doomed kind of thing. I don't think that that is maybe scientifically 100% certain. I also don't think it's, from a point of solidarity and strategy, that useful to say because they're fighting, and as communities, but also even states themselves. I don't think it's that useful to say, but I would say that the Paris Agreement, in many ways, sacrificed what small islands had been asking for, which was, real recognition for the fact that they are already, facing climate impacts very, very severely in the very near term, and it's like threatening actually the state itself and territory. And what the Paris Agreement included in the decision that accompanied it was a sort of a get out of jail free clause, because the United States was adamant that it wanted to have no liability for damages in the future. And so there was a sort of trade-off between an acknowledgement of 1.5 as getting its way into the agreement and the liability clause being inserted. So I think you have to look, the devil's always in the detail. But I really wouldn't say that it safeguards their future at all. I don't know where Mary Robinson's got that from.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move swiftly on to Seán. So Seán is a researcher at TASC, which is the think tank for action on social change. And Seán is working on a work stream on just transition, which he'll speak about in a moment. What that really means and how it actually manifests in Ireland, and maybe some things about what we could do. Seán, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Megan. That was an excellent presentation from Nathan, and I think really grounds this conversation in just transition. I might just pick up on Nathan's final point, because obviously it's a very important one relative to everything we're talking about in terms of the Paris Agreement. I think one of the sad things about where we're at now in terms of ambition is people are still talking about putting us on a pathway to achieve Paris. And we know, as Nathan has said, Paris is insufficient. It's long since time that we should be put on a pathway to achieve it. That said, and I think it's important to note, given the book that we're reading, I spent the 4 years, 5 years working with Mary Robinson on climate justice, and I would accept her optimism, whilst I know that presidents like Anote Tong would have said during Paris that they have to go and tell their people that their islands may not survive on the outcome of the decision. If anyone reads the book, the opening segment of it is about the very next year at COP22. Very next year, COP22 in Marrakesh, and how that COP took place with Trump elected. There's no way that the Paris Agreement would have gotten over the line a year later, because the contingency that was built between the superpowers, Europe and China and the US, would have fallen to pieces. So it's a basis from which to begin, and it's totally insufficient, but it is something. Can I share my screen? And I just kind of lashed together some slides after we kind of spoke, because I realized I didn't want people just staring at me for the whole time.
Yeah, you should be able to share your screen there.
Fantastic, thank you. Cool. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Brilliant. All right. So yeah, we're talking about just transition, and it's intimately linked to what Nathan was talking about in terms of justice. It's climate justice is mostly conceptualized as an issue of global concern, and in some ways reparations are necessary for colonialization and extractive processes. We have to be aware that extractive processes and extraction of wealth from poor to rich occur within countries as well as between countries. And in many regards, a just transition lens brings that focus. Just to begin, you could go back and read Mary's book, but actually sometimes you could just read Bob Dylan, and North Country Blues, written in 1964, is a song about a failed transition. At the time, it was about exploiting laborers in Latin America to replace iron ore workers in the northern states of America. But those words, "Come gather around, friends, and I'll tell you a tale," about a time when a town had fallen empty as a result of a badly managed transition, is what we're facing into in terms of climate action and the potential negative repercussions of climate action. To link Bob Dylan to just transition, and in a very obscure manner, I had the good fortune to travel with Mary to what was a pretty, if we're talking about optimistic, I would say a sickeningly optimistic event in California in 2018, just after Mary had launched her book, which was organized by the Governor Brown, Climate Action Week, which was a lot of show and not a lot of substance. But the City Lights bookstore, where people like Allen Ginsberg and Bob Dylan would have hung out, I managed to find a copy of Mary's book in it and stick it in the window just to get a photo of it. So that's Mary talks about Ken Smith in the book, in the chapter on leaving no one behind. And Ken initially wasn't dealing with climate action at all. It was a zinc ore mine that was shutting, and he had worked in it since he was a young fella. And I think the important line from the book is that workers will not resist change, as Ken says, and he's right. In fact, Friends of the Earth Europe recently conducted a study which highlighted that although most oil workers in the UK have never heard of just transition, they do appreciate the importance of taking climate action. The issue is fairness within it. It's an extractive system, but it extracts the workers' time as well as and their efforts, as well as the natural resources from our earth. Ken's situation, when he finished, Ken was in Canada. I don't know how many of people on this webinar will have read the chapter, but he was in Canada, and when the zinc mine closed, he moved thousands of miles across the country, himself and his wife and family, to find other work. Now, to me, that's not a just transition in any way, shape, or form. People occupy space, their communities are important. A sense of belonging is important to people. If the transition that we're facing catastrophically disrupts people's lives, it will not work. Fundamentally, people will resist that type of change. So I would say that Ken's point is very important. Workers won't resist change, but I think I'd caveat that with once it's fair. Just to give a little bit of background on where the concept of just transition comes from. Tony Mazziacchi was leader of the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers Union in the US. He was also a World War II veteran, and following World War II had managed to go through college on the GI Bill, which was a package that allowed vets to retrain and reskill after the war. When it came to the counter-nuclear movement, the ban the bomb movement, Ken was a significant figure in that, but he also represented atomic workers, so he realized he was sensitive to the needs of that community, and would have called for a super fund, something similar to the GI Bill, to allow atomic workers to retrain if they were going to ban nuclear armament. And then later on in his life, around 92, 93, when the UNFCCC process, the United Nations Framework Convention, would have been getting going, and awareness was growing about climate and its impacts, and the potential for fossil fuel workers to be left stranded by the transition. Tony would have called for the same super fund to be reinstigated for fossil fuel workers. Superfund was deemed to have negative connotations, so the term slowly changed to just transition, and that's what we use today. I don't know if people have had the opportunity. For the last 2 days, the National Economic and Social Council has been hosting the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Council Network annual conference. And it's been fantastic, actually. And Sharon Burrows spoke yesterday morning. She's head of the International Trade Union Confederation. And she would have been a central figure, along with people like Annabella Rosenberg and others, in bringing just transition into the Paris Agreement and really shining light on it more recently. Her discussion yesterday would have centered almost exclusively on the need for social dialogue. Really what we're looking at is a transformation of our societies unlike anything we've ever seen, and it won't be realized without deep and enduring social approval. I think people can conceptualize this a whole lot better now than they could 8 months ago. We've seen a situation where our response to the global coronavirus pandemic has been totally contingent on the public accepting pretty dramatic interventions to prevent the spread of the virus. With climate change, we're talking about maybe not quite as dramatic interventions in the short term, but certainly very significant, massive interventions over the long term, and public support must be enduring. Now, the only way that, we're already seeing evidence of public support for the coronavirus measures waning. And we can't afford that with climate. So how do we change? How do we transform our society without losing public support? And ultimately, the public, because as Nathan said when he was speaking earlier, it's about justice. It's about sharing the benefits and burdens of what's happening, so that you're not impacting marginalized groups, whether that's within your country or internationally, so that you're not continuing exploitive and extractive processes in order to bulldoze over emissions reductions that ultimately will fall short. There's some great work that's been done by the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, which looks at issues like the wind farm that was attempted to be built at Lake Turkana over Masai Mara land, and without any free, prior and informed consent from the local communities. And this was resisted, and ultimately it's taken 16, 17 years to get that wind farm built. If you want climate action to be fast, it really has to be fair. So Sharon Burrows was brilliant at speaking on the social dialogue at every level, where workers have to be involved in planning their own futures. They have to see a future for themselves in the transition. If there's workers who are too old to reskill and retrain, there has to be the social safety nets in place. And ultimately, the jobs that are found have to be dignified jobs, have to be unionized jobs. They have to give people a sense of belonging that may be lost in the transition away from fossil fuels. So obviously in Ireland, Bord na Móna is a critical example. It's our one very significant, we have others, but it's our most significant employer in the extractive sector. And so there has been, many would say it's taken the government too long, but there is now a Just Transition Commissioner, and there's a Just Transition Fund, which is worth about 11 million currently. And that's being used to manage a transition in the Midlands. It's very much far from perfect, and ICTU have put out a brilliant paper on it, which I'd strongly advise people read if they want to understand more about the specific challenges of Bord na Móna. But there's also agriculture, and for Ireland, this may be the bigger stumbling block. Agriculture represents about 33% of our emissions. And it is obviously the lifeblood of a lot of communities around the country. Maybe more surprisingly though, it's the most unequal sector in the country in terms of income. So the economic opportunities provided by agriculture are significantly unequal. And that means that a transition which is about reducing the herd or limiting greenhouse gas emissions could fall very unevenly. And so we need to ask ourselves how to plan, how to build through that. That's been the focus of my work with TASC, because we often, like, it's easy to think of an extractive sector like fossil fuels and how we're extracting a resource and how the benefits of the extraction move up and go to the people who, in that champagne glass that Nathan showed, are at the very, very top. But the same thing is happening in terms of agriculture. So here in this schematic, which I would argue is our current model, you have got farmers on the left who are producing products that are taken on by large, either the beef barons or large agribusiness operations, and they're receiving a very low price for what they're producing. Or they're selling directly to this grey basket here representing the multiples, the supermarkets, your Lidls, your Aldis, your Tesco's. And those two are putting enormous downward pressure on the farmers. And on the other side of this equation, you have the consumers. And the consumers are maybe time poor, they may be cash poor, they maybe don't have a kitchen in their accommodation, and so they can't cook fresh produce. So you have a situation where the multiples, the large supermarkets, are extracting the labor and the resources of the community. And all of this is channeling up to shareholders ultimately. A much fairer system would look something like this. And this is where I think you begin to understand the scope of climate action and how climate action is very much about social policy as well as environmental policy. So if you have a situation where a farmer is given the tools and resources necessary to cooperatize their businesses at the local level, they will see benefits coming back from either local abattoirs or local creameries, as used to be the case. If the community is given the tools, the money and the resources, they too can benefit from community-led approaches to the production of food. And on the far side of the equation, if we have basic measures like a 4-day work week or a living wage, or the right to housing even, you begin to see a community that would be able to shop local, would be able to get produce that is fresh and is directly from the farmer, and would render better prices for the consumer and better price for the producer. So this work is basically attempting to take what's known as the Preston model or a community wealth building model and apply it to rural communities. The challenge is that the Preston model, as it's currently described, is focused on how public procurement in urban areas can go to workers' cooperatives to benefit local communities, how public procurement can benefit local communities. Challenge is there's not many public banks or pension funds or credit unions or universities in rural areas. So we have to start thinking laterally about how communities can benefit from public spending in rural areas. And one very obvious way is climate action itself. So how can we make sure that public spending on climate action sticks in local communities? I can talk more about the Preston model and its ramifications for a potential just transition later, but I'll end on this. It's the closing paragraph of North Country Blues. I took a trip around Ireland in a camper van. I was paid to do it. I was fortunate to interview farmers and listen to their aspirations about the future and what climate action might mean for them. And one thing that came true really strongly was a massive concern about the loss of young people from the communities nothing, is that closing line that Dylan says, having nothing to hold young people in rural areas, and a risk of a large corporate agenda taking over rural agriculture. If we do that, I think we will have failed, and we have to, a just transition for Ireland needs to imagine a future where rural areas can thrive thanks to climate action, and that in turn will create the virtuous sort of cycle necessary to see demand proliferate rapidly across the country. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Seán. That was really excellent. And yeah, I think a lot of the points that you mentioned, I've heard a lot of people really speak, yeah, quite animatedly about them recently, in particular agriculture and the just transition, because this does seem to be an area that, like, you know, it's very tense for a lot of people who consider themselves climate justice advocates and environmentalists, and the media has had a really strong role to play in creating that dichotomy between farmers and environmentalists, when farmers are really stewards of the land, and yeah, they like, friends have told me that when they actually speak to a lot of the farmers in rural areas in Ireland, they understand the need for change, but it does need to be fair. So that line that you mentioned really resonated with me, that workers won't resist change if it's fair, and the system that is cyclical that we've been you know, forced into is really just benefiting those beef barons and people at the top and the supermarkets, and not your day-to-day farmer who's just trying to scrape by and is often a pensioner. Yeah, really interesting. I was wondering if you could build a little bit on that concept of the social dialogue that you mentioned. I know this is something that NGOs across the country are calling for, and the government has set it out as something that it is planning on doing, but it hasn't really created very formal ideas, to my knowledge, around how it's really going to happen. So just practically, what is this concept of a social dialogue, and what would it look like in the communities that people are calling in from around the country?
I'd say there's two parts to that answer, Megan. The first part would be that very much the social dialogue has, the workers' dialogues have to take place, whether that's the tripartite dialogues between the employers, the government and the workers, to ensure that those transitions are in place. That's first and foremost the primary objective of a just transition. And so I think we have to separate that maybe from the broader social dialogue, which would exist, I think, at the local level. You know, people think locally, they don't think regionally or nationally about their concerns. I've been saying it a lot lately, but I think we have to actually stop talking about climate action and start talking about local development, and how that local development can incorporate climate action in the true sense of sustainable development. Because for communities in Ireland, it's about you know, adequate, reliable, quality public transport. It's about, like, how do you get to the pub if the drink driving rules have been brought in to such an extent that you are now isolated in a rural village? It's you know, it's about heating. I had the privilege of knocking on doors during the general election, and it was February, well, it was January for most of the canvassing, and I was genuinely astounded by the amount of people who, when I said to them, listen, go inside, your house will freeze, they said, my heating's off, it's already freezing. There's large amounts of energy poverty in this country, and these are the issues that we have to solve, and we solve them through climate action. But we don't, I like, if we spend our time talking to people about climate action, I think we're at nothing, because the benefits have to come from local development and people seeing their lives getting better. So the current national climate dialogue, I think there's been two, and they happened, one I think was in Tralee and the other maybe in the Midlands, and they were at a very regional level. And I just don't think that people think along those lines. And I'm hopeful that maybe we will see a transition in the near future of that sort of national dialogue to a much more localized level, where people can actually, what I'd love to see is a type of citizens assembly, because, and this is, my work looks at this a lot, and I know Dr. Patrick Bresnan in Maynooth has done great work around water schemes on this, but who participates in climate dialogues in Ireland? That's very important, right? Like it's generally better educated people. It's generally people with better livelihoods. It's certainly not it's not a single mother who can't afford childcare for their kids, you know, like, so if the participation isn't coordinated and everyone is enabled to take part, then the climate action that we undertake will reflect the needs of the wealthiest people in our society, and that's a terrible idea. So I think we have to look first at addressing inequality, both in terms of participation and then later in terms of how can climate action itself be a tool of tackling inequality.
Great, thank you. I think that's really given a strong analysis of how climate justice kind of manifests and can improve in Ireland in our more local context, which complements Nathan's talk really well around the more global and far-reaching elements of and the historical responsibility and the responsibility teamed with the capability that requires what we actually do nationally, but then how this actually happens, is on a very local scale and should enable people to actually fully participate. Otherwise, it's tokenistic. So, thank you very much for that. And if you have any resources, feel free to pop them just Sean in the chat box, or you can send them to me after and I'll send them around to all the participants. So we're going to move into the Q&A with Nathan, Sean and Ciara Murphy from the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice. So I'll briefly introduce Ciara, and just to say that the Jesuit Centre is a member of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, which is a coalition of between 35 and 40 environmental, youth, internationalist, anti-poverty, just generally social justice organisations in Ireland. So Ciara is an environmental policy advocate in the Jesuit Centre, and she works on influencing policy change at a national level, as well as focusing on community-based local initiatives that Sean spoke to just a moment ago. So she achieves this through commentary, public consultation, submissions, and collaborating with peer NGOs and other organisations. So thank you very much for joining us, Ciara. So I'll start off with a question for yourself, Ciara, and it's about the climate law that is in progress in Ireland. It's being drafted at the moment. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the loopholes that have been highlighted in this climate bill that's been drafted, and what people on the call can do to make this stronger, because I think as Nathan and Sean both spoke to, the Paris Agreement, and there are some drastic inadequacies there that mean that it's not very useful in the long run for a lot of reasons. So yeah, if you could pick up on what people can do locally around this climate bill, that'd be really helpful.
Hi, thanks for having me on. So I'll just run through a couple of the loopholes first. So the bill itself is actually quite, it is fairly weak in terms of its ambition, and also there is a lot of loopholes, as you said. So one of the main things is that the bill says that we need to pursue our carbon neutrality, or our 2050 ambition objective to be carbon neutral, but we don't have to achieve it. It doesn't say that you need to pursue and achieve, it's just pursue. So that is a big loophole that's there, which needs to be closed. There's also some of the definitions around carbon budgets and some of the language. So there's a lot of, you need to refer to something, which is quite weak in that you can refer to it and then there's no obligation to fully take it into account. You can just dismiss it. So some of the vague language and definitions need to be tighter. So some of the ambiguity is kind of gone. So there's no get out of jail card, I suppose. And then there's also the issue where we have to. So the bill does, it does say that we need to have carbon budgets, but there's no obligation that the carbon budgets that we draw up are actually in line with the programme for government or our 2050 obligations or objectives. So it's there, but they're not really tightly linked up, so that it can be a bit ambiguous. And then also there was a really big problem in that there's no mention of just transition, and you have to have regard to climate justice, but you don't have to. There's nothing stronger than that. So that is a huge weakness in it, in that there is no the justice element and the just transition element are left off it completely, and you need to have some sort of mandate or allowance for it so that it's done in the proper way. Another big one as well, I think Sean mentioned it, or Sean mentioned the topic as well, is that there's not much mention of dialogue or public participation, which would need to be like that. That'll be a huge part. It's just like all of the action is done at local level, or like a lot of the implementation is done at local level. So if you don't have effective public participation at the local level, as Sean, it's just not going to work. So those are the main things, I suppose. Oh, and how you can get involved. Well, it's at the it's currently in front of the Climate Action Committee, so you can actually watch it, and all of the experts are being asked these really important questions, and they're giving good advice. But I think the main thing that we can do is put pressure on politicians or on our local public representatives to actually to implement the changes that the experts are advising. So a lot of it is just pressure and heat and asking to do it, I suppose. And I know Stop Climate Chaos have an email action, so that will be one easy and effective way, I suppose, of doing it.
Great, thank you. So people can watch the DAW committee online, and they can email their TDs from the Stop Climate Chaos website to put pressure on them.
Yep.
Great, thank you very much for that. It's really clear about those loopholes, and I think it's totally striking that it doesn't mention just transition and just has regard to climate justice, but doesn't actually have to do anything. It's not mandated to do anything specifically related to that concept. It's pretty bizarre. So I think Stop Climate Chaos have a press release as well outlining all of these loopholes. So yeah, that's on the website too. Great. Okay, so we have a few questions in the Q&A box. There's one there at the top from Patricia. Yeah, it says, how do we reclaim the term sustainability, e.g. sustainable agriculture or forestry, aviation or tourism industries? Is it interpreted as policies or subsidies for business as usual? Yeah, so I think, how do we reclaim that term sustainability that has been kind of co-opted by many different industries? Would anybody, who would like to take this question?
I'm happy to go first if that's helpful.
Yeah, go for it.
I think one of the big issues that international development has been dealing with for about 30 years was structural reform, right? Like this whole idea of if countries had to get aid, it was going to be contingent on them changing their systems, right? I think the new massive issue globally is going to be this reliance on the private sector that is so deeply embedded both within the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. And it really has enabled this concept of sustainability to become co-opted, I guess, is the only word for it. I think that generally speaking, though, it goes back to what we were saying previously about the localized nature of the changes we have to see. I think it's the language that works for local communities that's most important. It can't be a top-down language. It has to be a language that communities arrive at by their own volition.
Great, thanks very much, Seán. Nathan, just building on the concept or the topic of language there, you were involved in a project around framing climate justice and the language that we use to communicate climate justice. So I was wondering if you could just tell us briefly some of the, just top line level about what that project was and who was involved and some of the key takeaways around that communication of climate justice.
Yeah, I can, one sec, I can actually share my screen again. There were some slides that I didn't get to that speak about this. Hopefully you can see it. The Framing Climate Justice project was run by 350.org, which are like a climate campaigning organization, as well as a group in the UK called NEON, the New Economics Organisers Network, and another group called PERC, which I can't remember what that acronym stands for, but they're like a small research think tank. It was conducting testing, so we did focus groups, YouGov polls, and street testing around how the UK public, if you know, whatever we conceive of that as, what it sort of thinks about climate justice. We also did a sort of extensive literature review because there's not a lot of sort of studies that have been done about how people think about climate justice per se. There's a lot of studies that have gone into thinking about how people conceive of climate change and what their responses are to different frames for climate change, but less so about climate justice, so all the issues that I brought in. So we did this project over, it's actually been about 18 months now because it's been sort of extended, brought together a real diversity of people from UK climate movements, and through a sort of series of like residential meetings, came up with basically like different narrative frames to go out and test. So we sort of tested 4, and there were frames around responsibility. So a lot of what I talked about, I talked about it in the way I talked about it because it was what I assumed to be a largely friendly audience, but actually just talking about responsibility we found doesn't really work that well. We also tested a narrative or a frame around emergency that surprisingly also didn't perform very well. We tested a narrative frame around solidarity that did work very well. So you can see some of the key recommendations from the project here on this slide. I'll put a link in. It's actually going live next week. A full like resource hub that will have like all of the research, what the questionnaires were, all of the findings, the recommendations in full, the guides that are coming out of this. But yeah, basically it's hard to generalize too much, but what we sensed was you do need to leverage hope, but you can't overdo it. You need to it's not always immediately obvious how climate change is an issue of justice and how it connects to other issues, but you can use some examples. So you can talk about the economy as a rigged game, or you can talk about other examples where we have like a sense of the collective, like in the UK, the NHS, which obviously over COVID has become everyone's like thing that they want to die to defend, because yeah, it's seen as like a valuable public service and asset. So there's a bunch of recommendations, but yeah, it's essentially the message that I took from it was solidarity is actually a really powerful sort of thing to speak to, and people want to feel like they're in solidarity with other people. So if you frame things like that, then, you know, because I agree with Seán that it's really hard to just think about the world all at once and to like start at that point and say, you know, you need to do this. And there's this global climate change and people have much more immediate concerns. But I think we're also always surprised to find just how much people are really willing to act in solidarity with others, even if they themselves are, you know, struggling in some way or another. It's an amazing thing about human beings, actually. So that's some of the findings, but yeah, I'll not bore you with too much of it.
Great, and that's all going live next week with resource packs. Great, perfect. Okay, great. So I think for the last, we've about 9 minutes left. Áine, would you be ready to talk about the local groups that people can get involved with?
It's great to hear all of the, sorry, someone's just doing the washing up in my kitchen just as I turned on my camera. So yeah, now they're closing the door, thank you. That's working from home. So what's exciting is to hear, I suppose, the perspective from Nathan about that like big global perspective, and also the perspective from Seán about local communities. And also it's really great that some people have asked the question about the climate bill, because I think we get that really nice link between global, national and local. And I work for Stop Climate Chaos, and that's essentially what we're trying to do. So we're trying to look at how can we advocate within our constituencies, within our communities for action there, and also for national action from our TDs that will empower local communities and help us achieve emissions reduction targets and climate justice that are in line with climate justice and fair shares. So we will be launching groups in the next week, which will mean that you can get together with other people who are interested in these kind of topics from your constituency. And the crucial part of these is that these groups are going to be rooted in the concepts of global justice that Nathan outlined earlier. And also a lot of the concepts of just transition and community development that Seán also outlined. And we'll be doing trainings, we'll be doing lots of different support for you, and we'll be working towards a national moment in December to kick us off with. So that's all I'm going to say for now. If you want to sign up, I'm going to put the link in the chat box, and yeah, sign up, and hopefully you can meet others in your area who, and you can fight for climate justice together. And then, yeah, so that is, yeah, that's it.
Great, and all of that will be available on the Stop Climate Chaos website. Yes, Áine's gone, but it will be. Okay, so just before we finish up, I'm just going to ask all of the panelists just one short question. So you have two options. Either you can give the people on the call a book or a resource recommendation that if they were to look at one thing after this, this is what you'd encourage them to look at. Or if you'd like to speak about how you got involved in this struggle. So one of those two things, either a resource that people should go towards or what got you involved in climate justice. And then we'll just close up just before, at about 1:15. So who'd like to go first? Maybe yourself, Ciara?
Yep. Funnily enough, actually, because my background's in environmental biology, so I was mostly on the environmental side, but I actually read Mary Robinson's book, and then I applied for the job that I'm in now, which is all about social justice. So I'll answer the second question. So yeah, it was actually it kind of turned climate justice from like an abstract thing into like, oh, it's real, it's tangible, and it's devastating. So yeah, it was actually one of the catalysts of why I decided to start working with JCFJ. And kind of the more I work there, the more I'm like, you can see the connections between the housing crisis and like all of the other issues. So yeah, that's
Great, thank you. If there's ever a testament to the book, I think that's it. So hopefully if people haven't started reading it yet and they have a chance to get their hands on a copy, yeah, please do begin to read it, and we'll have that more in-depth workshop in a few weeks. So Nathan or Seán, would you like to go next?
I didn't really have a resource off the top of my head. I'll obviously recommend a book. I contributed to it, but I think for me, it's more important to read about. I think most people on a call like this will be very familiar with a lot of the best climate writers and people like Naomi Klein and others. But it's really important to engage with books on social struggle. And one which is fascinating, and I've just finished reading, is Harry Belafonte's My Song. So that's a book I would definitely recommend. My own how I ended up in this world was just I spent 2 years working in Calcutta in India in a hospice, and wanted to try to continue doing that, and lost my way and ended up working with Mary Robinson, and now here I am.
Great, thank you. So it was My Song by Harry Belafonte, is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's the one.
Lovely, thanks, Sean. And what about you, Nathan?
Yeah, so I kind of recommended one book already in answer to one of the questions, but I would actually really rather recommend this book that I'm putting in the chat. Sorry, I'll put it again for everybody, called The Memory We Could Be, by actually a good friend of mine, Daniel Oskobojnik. The reason I recommend this is because, as Sean said, I think a lot of us are familiar maybe with some of the like mainstream books that have gone mainstream. They've gone mainstream for reasons, because they're very good. Naomi Klein's writing is good. Bill McKibben's writing is good. Eric Holthus. There are a number. Daniel's work is very good because it talks about all of the same things. It's about history. It's about the last 500 years of history, and about the future, but in a very poetic way. He's sort of inspired by Galliano, and it's actually quite reminiscent of Galliano's work in that it brings in a lot of facts, makes a very compelling argument, but at no point do you really feel like it's a boring kind of, academic or NGO style book. So it speaks to the heart, and that's why I would recommend that book. But the fourth book on your list, by Rebecca Solnit, is also fantastic.
Yeah, I think so too. I think I read that just after January 2016. So, but it seems to still be relevant. Okay, lovely. And Áine, you're on mute, or else your headset.
Yeah, it's my headset. God, tech's really going well for me tonight. I suppose I don't have one that I can think of that kicked it off for me, but there is an article by Mary Hegler, which I'm going to link, which is called "And the Greatest of These is Love." And it's just a really wonderful short article about having, like, love can be full of rage, love can be full of hope, but you do these things out of love for the people and the planet that you live on. And it's just great. I go back to it every time I feel a bit hard, the things are getting a bit hard, and it's a good one to go back to. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And I'll post all of these resources in a read and watch list that we have. So I'll send that around to everybody, not this evening, but tomorrow, as well as an evaluation form that'll be enclosed. So you can just give some feedback on the event, and also, just be kept in the loop about upcoming events. So like I said, this was the first event of our 2020-2021 Learning Hub, which uses 4 books decided by public vote as jumping off points for these discussions. So each book has kind of 2 events. One is a webinar like this, and one is a more in-depth participatory development education style workshop, where we have a workshop rather than a webinar, so we see each other's faces, and we do some online activities, because we're all learning how to do things differently in these unprecedented times. And we just really reflect on the concept and start to really explore the practicalities of bringing this work and new knowledge into our day-to-day lives. We also have a Goodreads group if you're on Goodreads, and you can join and mark the books as reading if you're reading them, and update your progress, and discuss with other people that are reading the books. And from the 12th to the 16th of November, there's a series of really great events, discussions and workshops taking place online and hosted by the COP26 Coalition. And that's called From the Ground Up. And I'll send around the link to that as well. And I'll put the link in the chat box in just a moment.